what I want to talk to you a little bit about is the therapy that we're developing, in that we are the only therapy that exists today where we're treating an ocular surface disease by delivering medication into the nasal cavity. So unlike other therapies for dry eye disease that are delivered as topical drops, this product is delivered into the nasal cavity. It stimulates the trigeminal nerve, which then ultimately stimulates what we call the lacrimal functional unit, which are the glands and cells responsible for producing healthy tear film on the ocular surface. It's novel not only in its mechanism, but in its route. I'm going to have John walk through the dry eye disease background.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So as we said before, dry eye is a nuisance disease. A lot of the patients go to their eye care professionals, whether they're optometry, ophthalmology, and there's not a lot that can be done that's really therapeutic. A lot of it is over-the-counter lubricants that just mask the symptoms that you have. But so we feel there's still a lot of potential in this space. There's a lot of unmet need from a patient perspective. Just to look at some of the numbers, 34 million adults in the U.S. have dry eye. Only half are diagnosed. So 16 million diagnosed. Only 2 million of that 16 are actually treated with a therapeutic. And 7 million have tried dry eye products, whether they're over-the-counter lubricants or the two therapeutic options, and have dropped off for different reasons. So just to look at some of the limitations of current treatments, most of the therapeutic options, Xiidra and Restasis, they really tackle the later stage of the disease, the inflammatory component of dry eye. So we call it more palliative care. We will be targeting way earlier in the disease segment. The other limitations are the slow onset of action. Cyclosporins generally take 3 to 6 months to work. So you can imagine patients, they don't feel that relief, or they may be using a lubricant while taking cyclosporin, and they tend to drop off. And of course, because the two therapeutic approaches target the ocular surface, you can imagine there could be eye-related tolerability and compliance issues. Burning, stinging, you can't wear your contact lenses when you instill the drops, a bad taste in your mouth. So these are the things we're hoping to avoid by taking a very different approach through the nasal cavity. So we'll get into some of the details around how this was developed. Jeff, back to you.
So what you'll see in the prospectus is we've been developing two different compounds, OCO1 and OCO2. These are both nicotinic acetylcholine receptor agonists, which mean they bind to nicotinic acetylcholine receptors, which are found throughout the body. You'll see from this slide here that both of the products have very different binding characteristics on the subtypes of the receptors. So the plots that you see there are actually the electrical current that is generated upon binding to these receptors. And you'll see there's slightly different activity, which was one of the reasons why we developed both products in phase 2 development. I'm going to focus today on OCO1, which most of you have probably heard of. The active ingredient in OCO1 is the same active ingredient as the drug Chantix for smoking cessation. The second product I won't spend as much time on, but there is data in the prospectus. And one of the things that I think is important is both of these products work quite well. They have been able to generate similar data not only across the clinical trials that we've developed them in, but across the molecule. So the class works very well. We've chosen OCO1 for a number of reasons, including our speed to be able to develop the product, the cost to get to market, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So OCO1 is a preservative-free nasal spray. It will be the only preservative-free nasal spray on the U.S. market when it enters the market in 2021. We developed this as a preservative-free product knowing that patients would use it chronically, and we didn't want any of those side effects associated with preservatives. In the European theater, all nasal sprays must be preservative-free, so we're already ahead of the game there on our manufacturing side. The novel mechanism of this disease is that the drug binds to receptors on the trigeminal nerve, stimulates those receptors, and basically stimulates the patient to be able to form their own stable tear film. And what we're trying to really do here is to reestablish the homeostasis of the tear film on the ocular surface. It works very quickly. You'll see a video within 15 seconds after delivery. The patient will start to tear and form their own tears on the ocular surface. And we've shown in a number of clinical trials that we can actually give the patient symptomatic relief in as quick as 5 minutes after delivery. So very different than the other products where you're going to get a 30 to 90-day prescription. You're going to come back. They're going to assess how you're doing. This is something that you're going to be able to take right there in the chair in front of the physician. They're going to be able to feel and see it work, and then they're going to go get their script filled at the local Walgreens. Really favorable tolerability, no stinging or burning associated with the product. So unlike the other products out there that are put onto the ocular surface, this completely spares the ocular surface. It's only delivered into the nose, and no lingering effects. So with Xiidra, we have a really bad taste. Patients complain of a copper penny taste in their mouth. With Restasis and with Xiidra, we hear patients complain about stinging to the ocular surface. I'm going to show you a video here, if we can have the video play, of a patient taking the product. And so you'll see the patient takes a spray into each nostril. It's important that we treat both nostrils because the pathways do cross over in the brain. The drug will bind to the receptors located on the trigeminal nerve. This allows for influx of cations that depolarize that nerve, and ultimately we get stimulation of what we call the lacrimal functional unit. So that lacrimal functional unit consists of meibomian glands that are in the lids that produce oily substance called meibum, the lacrimal gland which produces the aqueous component of our tears, and then also the goblet cells on the surface of the eye that will make the mucins. This is a real-time video of a patient taking the product. You'll see within 15 seconds, if you watch the lower lid margin of that patient, you'll see that tear film start to increase. We can do this in a very dose-dependent manner. As we escalate the dose, we can increase the amount of tear film on the ocular surface. Our goal is to really replace tear film on the ocular surface during those waking hours of the patient. So the patient will take it in the morning, they'll take it when they come home from work. That will keep them comfortable throughout the day until they go to sleep at night and close their eyes. This nasal delivery, although novel, this pathway has been understood in the literature for a number of decades. And so we've known that the trigeminal nerve controls basal tear production. Everybody in the room has probably experienced this at some point in time. If you have a really bad sinusitis with a lot of congestion in your nose and you're not getting airflow across those chemosensory nerve fibers, you'll wake up in the morning and your eyes will feel dry. And what we know is that if you anesthetize one side of your nasal cavity, it will decrease that contralateral eye by 34% of that tear production. So it's very important that we have airflow and stimulation across these nerve fibers. And we know that each one of these cells or tissues is innervated by that parasympathetic system. We talked a little bit about what each of these glands will bring to the table with regards to tear film, but I think it's important because tear film is highly complex. The lacrimal glands not only produce the aqueous component, but there's a number of enzymes included in that aqueous component. There are antibodies, there's antimicrobial products in there. They're very cytoprotective and healing. So when we have a damage to the front of our cornea, we actually see messenger RNA and transcription upregulation in the lacrimal gland. And while that lacrimal gland is secreting tear fluid, it's also secreting all of these components that help us to heal. And what we're doing is really pushing that process along. The meibomian glands producing this lipid layer. If you've ever heard or had a sty before, that's a plugging of one of these meibomian glands, and it's very painful. But that lipid needs to free flow onto the ocular surface to coat that tear film. And then the mucins, which are the goblet cells, very similar to goblet cells we'd have in our GI tract as well, form this mucoaqueous layer that binds to the ocular surface. Without any one of these three layers, we have a breakdown of the homeostasis of the tear film. And there's really no substitute for natural tear film. So if you've ever gone to the store to buy a re-wetting drop or a lubricating drop, gives you about 15 to 20 minutes of relief, you're putting another one back in. All you're really doing is diluting your own natural tear film. I think the important therapeutic portion of our product here is not necessarily the drug we're putting into the nose. It's the tear film that we're stimulating through that pathway. And so we're putting a number of classes of mucins, lipids on the ocular surface, cytoprotective elements. If you look at this image here, on the left-hand side, we see what the healthy ocular surface looks like, where we have all three layers of tear film. And in the middle, you'll see as we break down the tear film, due to either a loss of that lipid material, where we have increased evaporation of the tear film, or just an overall decrease in the amount of the aqueous component, we then transition to this dry eye disease where we have inflammation, cell damage, irritation. Most of the therapies that are out there, Restasis and Xiidra included, are really treating that inflammation and irritation, which is really an end product of the disease, and it's more palliative in nature. You're not getting at the underlying homeostasis of the tear film, and that's really where we think that OCO1 comes into play. In order to get at that homeostasis, we need to stimulate those glands and cells to produce fluid, and then we will ultimately be able to treat patients and eliminate them ever getting to that stage where they have inflammation and irritation. So we're able to get into the disease process much earlier. I'm going to share with you data from a number of clinical trials today. The first two are the ONSET program. ONSET 1 is a phase 2b study that was completed last year. ONSET 2 is a phase 3 study that's currently ongoing. And then the MYSTIC and the ZEN trials that I'll go a little more into are studies that are currently enrolled and will have data in Q1 of 2020. So the first one that we'll go over is the ONSET 1 study. So this is a dose-ranging study looking at 3 different doses of OCO1 versus a placebo control. One thing to note about all of our clinical trials that you'll see in the slides or in the book is that these are all randomized controlled clinical trials with prospective endpoints. So none of these are post hoc analyses. All are pre-specified before we started the study. And you'll see that our primary sign endpoint was Schirmer score, with the primary symptom endpoint being eye dryness score. In these studies, we have 28-day endpoints, and patients take the product twice daily. Baseline characteristics are pretty similar across all groups. The one thing I'll just note here is that our high-dose group had a slight imbalance. They're a little healthier as the patients go. You'll see that the Schirmer score slightly higher than the rest of the groups. The eye dryness score slightly lower than the rest of the groups. And the only reason we pointed out is as you see the 0.6 and the 1.2 milligram per mil doses, you'll say, I'm not sure which one looks better. This is part of the reason why we think the 1.2 milligram or the higher dose may look similar, is that they were just a little bit healthier at baseline. And so we're looking at both of those dose groups as we move into phase 3. Here's the primary endpoint data. And on the left, you'll see the mean change in Schirmer score from baseline. So the Schirmer score measures the amount of tear film that's being produced. And you'll see that we can show statistically significant improvements in the amount of tear film in both the 0.6 and the 1.2 milligram per mil doses. And then you'll see over on the right-hand side, this is a responder analysis that the FDA considers clinically relevant, which is those patients that achieved a 10 millimeter or more change in Schirmer score. And you'll see here again, all 3 doses highly statistically significant. On the left-hand side of the next slide, you'll see our secondary symptom endpoint. So this is the eye dryness score. You'll see again, 0.6 and 1.2 were statistically significant. This is at week 3, and this is in a controlled adverse environment chamber. So we put patients in a chamber. We bring the relative humidity in that chamber down below 10%, and they watch TV for 2 hours while we blow hot air on their face to really exacerbate that dry eye condition. So it simulates a condition that we would experience if we were, say, on an airplane. And you can see that these patients have immediate symptomatic improvement that's statistically significant. On the right-hand side, this is in the normal clinic environment. And you'll see in the 0.6 milligram per mil dose group, we have statistically significant improvements in symptom score. In the 1.2, we missed that p-value, although we think it's due to those baseline imbalances that I talked about before. And so as we move forward in development, both the 0.6 and the 1.2 will be tested in phase 3. This is fluorescein corneal staining, so another secondary endpoint that we looked at and we will also look at in phase 3. So with fluorescein corneal staining, we are actually looking at the health of the corneal epithelium. So when we put fluorescein onto the surface of the eye, it shouldn't stick. It should just actually wash right out of our eye and down our lacrimal ducts. If it does stick to the corneal surface, that means there's no epithelium there. So we don't want to see staining. And here you'll see that we have improvements in corneal staining both in the nasal and inferior region as well as in the total score that are statistically significant. And you can see in the other 3 regions that all trended towards OCO1. When you look at the Xiidra label, this was their primary endpoint. They only share data from inferior corneal staining alone. So they were not able to achieve any of these endpoints. The other thing that's important to understand is those endpoints in the Xiidra label are from day 84, whereas our endpoints are at day 28. So very early on in the treatment paradigm. Safety and tolerability profile is quite clean. Patients will often sneeze, so this pathway is very close to the trigeminal nerve. It's very temporally related to the administration, so within 10 to 20 seconds after delivery, patient may sneeze. It's very mild. Not all patients sneeze, and the numbers you're seeing here are actually the number of patients. So if they sneezed at any point in time over the course of the 28 days, they were counted. These aren't the number of events. And then occasionally you'll get patients that have some throat irritation. So our product is actually delivered to the anterior portion of the nasal cavity, so to what we call the inferior turbinate. Most of you who've ever taken a nasal spray, you're often trying to spray it up into your sinuses or get it very deep into the nasal cavity. This is very anterior, so we often have to teach patients, don't spray this way up into your sinuses. It'll get into your throat and you'll have a little bit of irritation. When they just spray it into the anterior portion of the nose, we have no problems. I think the other important point to point out is it's a 50 microliter spray into each nostril. Your typical nasal spray is about 150, so it's about a third of your normal nasal spray volume. In this study, we had no systemic adverse events, no serious adverse events, and the other thing is it spares the ocular surface. So when we talk about other indications that we're interested in, I think it's really important. You've got a patient that walks through the door that has an irritated, inflamed eye. We're not putting a drop onto that irritated, inflamed eye. We're actually providing them some symptomatic relief with their own tear film. We've had 2 successful end of phase 2 meetings, both on the clinical side and on the CMC side. On the clinical side, the FDA accepted the Onset 1 study as one of our registration trials. We have to do another phase 3 study, which is the Onset 2 study. And then we have to do this Zen PK study where we're looking at the oral dose of the drug versus the nasal dose and just proving to the FDA that the nasal exposure systemically is quite low. So we expect to have this data from this study in the first quarter. We think that the high dose will be 10x less than the oral dose of Chantix, and then the low dose will be 20x less. So we don't expect any systemic exposure that will be of concern there. We'll also have acceptability from the FDA on any toxicology work, so we don't have any other toxicology studies to do. And our current manufacturing and stability plan is signed off on the CMC side. So that brings us to our phase 3 study that's currently enrolling at the moment. This is in you'll see the design looks very similar to the Onset 1 study. It's in 750 patients, so much larger, and we've dropped that lower dose, and now we're only looking at 2 doses versus placebo. You'll see that the primary endpoints for signs and the secondary endpoint for symptoms are the same as we did in the Onset 1 study, so no changes there. And again, patients are taking this twice daily times 28 days. This is the design of the Zen study, the PK study that I referenced. Here we're looking at the oral dose of Chantix versus the nasal dose of varenicline. Patients will get randomized to either oral versus nasal. There will be a 14-day washout period, and then they'll flip and receive a dose, whether it be the opposite delivery mechanism. And then we'll be looking at pharmacokinetics here. So patients are inpatient, healthy volunteers, where we're taking blood samples after delivery. On the CMC side, we are ready commercially to develop this product. We've been filling on a commercial grade line since phase 2 development. We are now producing tens of thousands of these nasal pumps at every campaign. On the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see our trade unit, which is a 30-day supply. On the right-hand side, you'll see the sample unit. So patients will receive somewhere between a 5 or a 15-day supply of drug. We think this is going to be really important not only for the patients, but for the physicians. So if you get Xiidra or Restasis today, you're basically sent off to get a 90-day supply of drug, and then the physician says, I'll see you back, and then we'll see how your ocular surface looks. So you're really going to go 3 months before you really get assessed as to how that therapy is working. Here, you're going to be able to take this sample right in the chair in front of the physician. You're going to see yourself tear, feel yourself tear. So the physician's going to know exactly that the product is working. Then you're going to go home and you're going to have that drug until you bridge to go to the pharmacy to get that filled. We just think that that early symptomatic relief, as well as the ability to see the drug work, is going to be important for patients and physicians. So just in summary, our timelines here. For the Onset 1 study, as I mentioned, already enrolled. The Onset 2 study, we'll have top-line data in the midpoint of next year. And then the Zen and Mystic studies will both read out in that first quarter. We look to have an NDA submitted in the second half of 2020 with an approval in the second half of 2021. I'm going to turn that over to John now just to talk about some of our commercialization.
Great, thanks, Jeff. As Jeff said, the NDA approval is expected the second half of 21. So our strategy is to launch in Q4 of 21. We will focus on 3 key areas in our commercialization plan. The first one is fielding a sales force that will call on the eye care specialists. So currently, the therapeutic approaches, both Xiidra and Restasis, are prescribed by optometry and ophthalmology, generally half and half, 50-50. So we feel a field force size of 150 to 200 will adequately cover all the eye care specialists that prescribe 80% of the current therapeutic approaches to dry eye. So that's important because they will also have the capacity, as we build out our pipeline, to carry other products that target the anterior segment, the front of the eye, and ocular surface. Secondly, we'll focus on educating the patient. The direct-to-patient efforts are very important. We've seen the other 2 players invest in this space, and actually the market grew. And as I said earlier, 34 million patients in the U.S., half are diagnosed, only 2 million treated. So there's a lot of room here to educate the patient to come in and get their eyes checked, not to mask it with an over-the-counter lubricant, but actually get a therapeutic that could work. So this is a lever we're going to focus on, especially differentiating on our mode of action and our nasal spray approach. And the last priority is going to be access. Access is very important here, both commercial insurance and Medicare. We feel that we'll be very competitive from a contracting perspective and should get commercial payers on board very early on, followed by Medicare following suit based on the timeline of how Medicare lists products. But not only the payer side is important, but it's also the patient journey. As Jeff mentioned, the patient will go home with a sample. That 15-day sample will also bridge that patient to get all the benefits investigations done, the prior auths, get all the paperwork out of the way so that the payer will then approve OC01 for them to fill the prescription. So we feel all 3 pillars are just as important. We have to focus on all of them and invest in all of them in order to have a successful commercial launch. In terms of Europe, Europe is a very fragmented market, different access issues with formularies, so we will look to partner in Europe and Asia and meet with different partners that have presence there already as we get closer to commercialization.
So I wanted to just touch base on our IP position. As of Friday afternoon, we entered into a license agreement for varenicline tartrate with Pfizer. We also have a very strong patent position of our own, which is we have a number of method and formulation patents issued with expiry in 2035, and that does not include Hatch-Waxman extension. We've also initiated global filing on these patents, so you can see the number of countries we've submitted in so far, and we expect those ex-US expirations to be around the same time as US. We're working on our pipeline. We have a number of compounds in development. I'm going to focus on OC01, but we talk a little bit about OC02 in the prospectus. You can see our first interest is in dry eye disease. That'll be our first indication. Second indication that we'll start next year will be neurotrophic keratitis. So neurotrophic keratitis is a disease, that's an orphan disease at the moment, that affects people who have basically 3 different types of etiologies. One are diabetic patients. One are patients that suffer from herpes simplex and herpes zoster that affect the ocular surface. And we actually have a breakdown of the epithelium. So when I talk about staining before, where you have these little dots of staining all over, these patients actually lose their entire corneal epithelium. It's very painful. Eventually, they get to a point where they lose sensation in the cornea and they can actually damage their cornea quite a bit. And the end stage is actually what we call corneal melting, where they actually have a hole right through their cornea. This is a disease that's only treated by one product today, which is recombinant human nerve growth factor. Costs patients about $90,000 for a 2-month supply. We think with 2 nasal sprays, we can actually do the same thing. The third indication, or label expansion indication that we're very interested in, are for patients that cannot tolerate their contact lenses throughout the day. So we have a number of patients in this category of contact lens intolerance where about 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the contacts need to come out and they become unbearable. We think that this product is perfectly positioned to be able to deliver therapy to those patients where you can have your lenses in your eye, deliver this into your nasal cavity. You'll use your own natural tear film to hydrate the lens and then coat the lens with that lipid layer, and it should give you symptomatic relief throughout the day. So that's one indication that we're looking to treat. The second one is patients that are going towards a refractive surgery, whether it be cataract surgery, LASIK surgery. Many of these patients have an unhealthy ocular surface leading into those surgeries, and so therefore their refraction and ultimately the corrective power that the physician puts into their eye is off. We think that delivering this product for 30 days leading into surgery will also ultimately create a healthy ocular surface. And then after surgery, we think that delivering the product for another 30 days will keep them comfortable, keep that ocular surface wet and hydrated. And so these are two big areas over and above dry eye disease that we think we have room to grow. I'll have Dan go over our financial summary.
So we've already had two successful funding rounds. Our Series A, where we brought in $22 million of capital in October 2017. That was with Versant and NEA. And then we followed that up with our Series B, where we raised another $93 million of capital as of February of this year. And we brought in an additional 2 new investors, including Flying L as well as Vita Ventures. And so that puts us in a really good capital position right now with $83 million of cash on hand as of June 30th of 2019, which puts us in a good position to be capitalized through NDA submission. And then the IPO proceeds that we're talking about today would be in addition to that to help build out our field sales force as well as additional R&D capability.
So the market opportunity we touched on a little bit before, but Restasis is on track to do $1.2 billion this year, same number that they did last year. Xiidra, $383 million, and they do not have Medicare Part D coverage. And then, as you know, Xiidra was recently acquired by Novartis for a total consideration of over $5 billion. So just in summary, the investment opportunity here really, I think, pivots around this near-term data milestone in the midpoint of 2020. It has a giant market of patients. There's already, as we cited, 7 million patients that have tried Restasis or Xiidra. The average patient stays on those products and falls off. So we think that there's a lot of patients out there just looking for the next opportunity for treatment. We have really strong financials. The proceeds from this round would basically be to, as Dan said, to support the commercialization and launch and additional R&D, but we have enough capital to take us through NDA. We have a great leadership team that I'll talk about briefly, but this product has a novel route of administration, novel mechanism of action. There's no other product out there that's delivering therapy through the nasal cavity. And if you see our leadership team here, you'll see that they've been involved in a number of companies in the eye care space, brought a number of therapies to market. And so this company, everything that you've seen that we've done here, we filed the IND for this product last year, May, and we're already halfway through phase 3 now. So we've been able to move quite rapidly, really, really great in execution. We have a great board of directors and good investors. These investors came in with a big Series B round. It was the biggest Series B round in ophthalmology, biggest single round. And we are really excited to have them also participate in the IPO. And that's the overview of the company.